I enjoyed like really digging into systems and understanding how things worked with each other. So I knew being technical was important, but one that didn't involve the implementation side of things. They sat me down and said, "Your resume still reads like somebody who's from the automotive sector." There was a room with the ball pit. So people would go in and like just sit in the, in the ball pit and they'd conduct their meetings. Mistakes that I made was definitely thinking I could. It was just such an aha moment for me.
Hey, welcome to a brand new podcast series where I interview product managers and leaders across the entire tech industry. So today we're going to talk to Aparna, who is a product manager at Airbnb. She started her career as a software engineer and then transitioned to product management at VMware after an MBA at Carnegie Mellon. Hey Aparna, great to have you on the podcast. I want to start out basically at the beginning. Maybe walk me through like how did you first get interested in tech and what drove you to the space?
All right. So I had very typical like journey growing up in India, going into engineering and everything. But I was someone who loved to drive cars, and so post my undergrad, I was like, I don't want to do the usual Infosys TCS thing where what are the options in front of me. So I said it made a lot of sense to move into the automotive space because, as I said, really passionate about driving cars. And 6 years in there, I realized there really wasn't a lot going on in that space. At best, we were trying to like tweak, talk here, look for like 1% optimization somewhere else, and it just wasn't exciting for me. And so I took some time and ended up like volunteering with a bunch of, or rather, this group in India, which was trying to build up India into a product hub. India is known to be like a very services based area, right? And so one of the things I had to do there was interview co-founders and various people working in different roles in tech and write blog posts about their journey. And that I ended up finding really interesting. Like I found that they were solving very interesting problems. Things were a lot more fast paced. It wasn't focused on these minor changes, but you've got an idea on how do you go about doing something. And so that made me realize that I did want to pivot industries. And that's how I decided, okay, time to make a switch to tech.
That's fascinating. So you actually got interested in tech just from kind of researching the space and speaking to the folks in the space. Do you remember some of the like very interesting conversations you had, or was there any one conversation you're like, this is really cool, this is what I want to do?
I think what initially got me into into like getting into working with this group was I read a lot, and I found that I was constantly keeping up to date of what's going on in various tech journals and what was just generally going on in the tech industry. And so that ended up being my entry point into this. And I think some of the conversations that I had there were two companies which were very complementary. I'm going to forget their names now, so I'm not going to mention what their names were, but they were trying to change how the entire interviewing process for engineers. I do know that one of those companies is now very widely adopted in the US and in India. And so how they were tackling that problem, right, which was these coding challenges and seeing how people's quality of code is, which is a very different way as opposed to going into an interview and going through that whole process of answering questions. You're actually getting an opportunity to test your skill. And so how these people had approached that problem was very interesting. Funny story, I ended up meeting one of the co-founders here in the US, and I didn't realize that this was one of the companies that I had interviewed. And just through a casual conversation, we suddenly realized, wait, we'd actually had this conversation a while back. So, yeah.
Nice. So it was kind of a bit of a throwback to a
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah.
Very cool. And so, you're really interested in the automotive sector, but you're not kind of finding your passion there. Then you start researching, speaking to people in the tech space. what's the next step then? Like, what did you do to plan forward?
So I thought I'll make the pivot while I was in the automotive sector there, try and move to tech. And I tried interviewing with a lot of different companies. I had even getting an interview call was really challenging. I was constantly getting interview calls for companies in the same space. And so I decided I needed something to help me, like, make the transition. And after talking to several people, an MBA decided, ended up being the direction that I settled on. And so I applied to various business schools, ended up getting into the Tepper School of Business at CMU. And so I said, all right, this is going to be my way to, help me position myself to move to tech. I was also very careful though about, what I wanted to do post the MBA. And so that ended up helping. I took a lot of time off between starting my MBA and when I was working. So I took like a 6-month break. That ended up being a very, very interesting period for me in terms of how I made, decisions about next steps.
Got it. So you consciously looked at the MBA as like, hey, this is going to help me switch careers, switch to more on the tech side of things. Um, was there anything that consciously, when you were applying for MBA, were you looking for any specific schools, any specific programs, or how were you thinking of that?
I had two factors. One was my GMAT score, of course, just being aware of, where I stood. The other one was, since I knew I wanted to move to tech, I was looking for schools that had, a strong presence in the tech space. So, which were good feeder schools to the tech industry. And so TEPA ended up being one of those schools that really stood out.
And since you already had, 6 years of experience on the software engineering side of things, be it in the automotive sector, how do you think that factored into your decision of, hey, I want to transition more to the business side of things or the product side of things?
So it was, I think, though my title was a software engineer, I had nothing to do with, anything computer science related. A lot of my work was related to very, very niche work that was very focused on these various systems within automobiles and trucks and so on. And so I think what one of the decisions that I had made at that point was I realized coding wasn't a strong suit for me. So sticking around in engineering didn't make a lot of sense. I enjoyed like really digging into systems and understanding how things worked with each other. So I knew being technical was important, but one that didn't involve the implementation side of things, right? And again, through these conversations that I had with a lot of people, I realized that I wanted something that would put me in the driver's seat quite literally, but not the person who's building the entire thing. So I think that for me then made direct sense to move into something more business related, because you're getting to define, what the big thing is, what the strategy is, and so on. And yeah, that's how I started making like decisions about what next steps would look like.
Did you have any conversations with your manager or other folks where they told you, hey, Aparna, you seem to be a great fit for a product kind of role, or did you get any direction like that from your mentors?
So that direction didn't come from work. The direction came through those interviews, actually. So I think I mentioned that the time period, right? And so because I was interacting with so many people in this space, I started noticing that people who I talked to who were PMs, I got very excited, talking to them and very very involved in the conversations. And I said, okay, there's definitely something here. And so those conversations actually ended up becoming or playing a big factor in terms of making my decision that, hey, I get into business school, tech is where I want to go, and PM's where I want to be. I also, like, PM wasn't, at least when I started, it was something that was picking up. It wasn't something that everyone was still considering. Excuse me. So I think this was just those networking conversations and those interviews ended up playing a really big part.
Yeah, and you talked about something very important there. I think this whole concept of where do you draw energy from and where do you actually get energy versus what seems to like suck your energy or drain your energy. I think for me also, you know, I saw this more from a size of company point of view. So when I was at companies which grew and became large or, much bigger, I found that as the companies became bigger, I started feeling more of a drain on my energy. And so, that's why I've recently, a couple of years ago, decided to go all the way to the startup end of things because I find that I get a lot more energy from that environment, from being able to, work in multiple situations, own different parts of the stack, etc. So yeah, I think this whole concept of energy is very important, and uh, it's great that you realize that yourself that hey, this is something that's really bringing me energy, and so let me make a conscious plan of how to shift there.
Yeah, I think you find what I find is you end up like feeling so down or just complaining to your friends very frequently about certain things that are frustrating you. And in my case, my friends are a really great sounding board. So when they notice a trend, they point it out to me, and that's like, okay, something's not okay here. So to your point, right? Like you pay attention to it, it helps you make these more intentional choices about what your next steps are going to be.
Yeah, that's great, and it's great that you have that feedback loop around you through your friends or colleagues or whoever. uh, so yeah, that's very important. Yeah, maybe moving to VMware itself. So you did first start as a PM intern at VMware. Uh, Talk me about, as you started your MBA, what was the first sort of race to get that internship? How was that whole process like?
Um, so that was a pretty like challenging time for me because, as I said, different domain, trying to move to something a different domain, wanting to be technical, and so it typically in an MBA, in an MBA cycle, first year you have these seasons, right, for recruitment, and I think I got one interview call in the first cycle, because I realized that, and I was really struggling. Like, I'd done all of these classes that were needed to position yourself for tech. I thought my resume made a lot of sense, and I was just chugging along, saying, "Okay, I'll handle this." And then come January, just one interview call for something that I just wasn't interested in, and that it was a bit of a shock. So there were seniors of mine who I went and spoke to, and some of them ended up like really playing a big role in helping me, start getting interview calls in the second cycle. They sat me down and said, "Your resume still reads like somebody who's from the automotive sector. You need to be focusing on transferable skills. At the end of the day, irrespective of the industry, irrespective of the job, there are a lot of transferable skills that can be applied. And so if you take a step back and look at, what you've done, you can see, like, for example, I've talked about digging into systems and understanding what's going on. That also can apply to tech. It can apply to, healthcare, because at the end of the day, you're trying to figure out what's going on and connect the dots, right? And so there were two or three of my seniors who ended up spending a lot of time with me and helping me, polish my stories, position myself, to be able to get those interview calls and then start prepping for it. And so that ended up making a big difference for me in the second round or the second wave of recruitment. I also did a lot of just proactive outreach. I ended up building like a system for myself where every morning, as soon as I woke up, I'd do a quick search on various job boards and places, identify 10 roles that I really liked, leave those job postings open, and then sometime during the day, I would get around to applying for it, making sure I went through our alumni database to see if anyone worked at that company, and also pinged like recruiters on LinkedIn. So I made sure I had about 1 or 2 hours every day to build out this entire system to help me with my recruiting, and that ended up paying off, because it's very easy to get stuck in this mentality of, oh God, I'm not getting internships, what's going to happen, all of that. This at least gave me some freedom also to go and just enjoy my MBA experience. Right, I was making sure I took care of recruiting. I had a system that was working, and then I could go to whatever else I wanted to. And so that whole process basically is what ended up getting me to VMware. I had reached out to a recruiter early on in the cycle, and I was just making sure I followed up, checking in if there were any opportunities, and they ended up replying to one of my earlier emails and said, hey, we have this position, would you be interested in interviewing? So that's how it panned out.
Just hearing about the race towards the internship gives me PTSD as well. It's such a sort of tense situation because first of all, tech is always the last to get into the recruiting cycle. So
Yeah.
all the folks who are getting into private equity, hedge funds, consulting, they're done. They have their internship sorted and they're kind of chilling through the next semester, the second semester. I unfortunately wasn't as organized as you. Seems like you were very organized through your search. I ended up waiting almost till the last minute, and I think very similar to what you said. Like VMware got back to you saying, "Hey, you had applied. We're still looking." I had applied to Google. I didn't even remember when, and in April, when internship started in June, in April I got an email saying, "Hey, we're still looking for this, yeah, open to this internship. Are you interested?" And that kind of panned out for me. But yeah, I think one of the factors that really makes a big difference is this constant staying in touch and just keeping contacts warm and keeping the space warm. I think I try to do that today as well, where I'm sure you also get reached out to by a bunch of recruiters, but while it's when you're secure in a job, it's easy to kind of dismiss those. It's easier to just say, "Hey, I'm not looking right now, but if there's anything exceptional, sure, like let me know," or something like that, where you're kind of just keeping your ears open, you're not shutting yourself off. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's definitely good to like just stay in touch with what's happening around you.
Yeah, I mean it's great that you make sure you follow up. I think I was getting into this situation of, okay, yeah, I'm not interested, and then I forget about it. But I think this course as well was a bit of an eye opener for me that hey, you can still take 15 minutes out of your day and just have a conversation and keep that connection warm because you never know where it's gonna help, right?
Correct. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So you got the um, the email back or the call back from VMware. What was the actual process like for the internship interview?
Um, a lot of it, it's been a while. So if I recall, a lot of it was very experience based. And so this particular role wasn't pure PM. It was, now that I think about it, it may have been more technical marketing than actual PM. Um, but as I said, a lot of it was very experience based. Some questions about the industry, whether I was familiar with VMware as well. Because VMware is its products are very technical, right? And so it's not something that everyone's heard of. They had a very good way of seeing if you've made the effort to understand what VMware does, which was to get you to explain virtualization to like a 3-year-old or to your grandmother or something like that. And people who typically go ahead in the process were people who had come up with really creative ways to explain what that concept was. So I think being able to answer things like this made a big difference.
Yeah, that's a spin of the Google interview questions, very popular. Of like when you click on a website in your browser, what happens behind the scenes or something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And how would you explain that to your mother, or how do you explain that to a 5-year-old or whatever?
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah,
I mean it's making sure you've done your homework, right? At the end of the day, particularly with these with companies like Google or these very technical companies, you want to be putting your best foot forward. Now, irrespective, you want to be putting your best foot forward. You need to make sure you've shown that you've done your research. So yeah.
So what was the internship like? And as you go through that, you mentioned that it wasn't exactly a PM internship. So did you already know by then that you wanted to become a PM? Did you make that, evident to your manager that, hey, I want to eventually transition to a full-time PM role?
Yeah, I was very clear about PM even starting off the MBA. It's just that because of how things panned out with the internship, I said I think at that point I was doing a trade-off between PMM and PM. I think I went into this saying my first option was PM, second option would be PMM, and that was a constant narrative that I was hearing from people around me that it's easy to transition. So I'd said, and I'd also gotten advice that even if you don't get PM right out of business school, if you end up in a PMM role in a technical company, you can always make the transition over. So this role had been positioned to me as I needed to build out an entire developer community during my internship. So it was basically creating like an online hub to host our APIs and SDKs, get like a community forum going. And so it was at the end of the day, I realized there was a lot of requirements gathering, talking to various people. I ended up doing a lot of external outreach as well for other companies that had built out their developer communities online, and then just come up with an entire website design for what this would look like, right? And so that when I was talking to one of the seniors who had helped me out, they said this actually is very similar to what a PM would do, which is, so I said, all right, I've at least got those transferable skills now. So going into full time, I could potentially focus on those. So that's how I was thinking about it, even as I went through my internship. I ended up having a lot of fun. Really enjoyed that whole process, and it was also good, like practical validation for me that all these conversations that I've had with those interviews and through my MBA and so on about what PM is. Um, it's this thing of theory versus actually applying it, right? Sometimes you think something's a great fit just hearing about it, but when you actually go and do it, you end up thinking it's not a good fit, right? So that ended up being a really good validation experience for me about this role that I was thinking of.
Yeah, and you were kind of thinking of the internship as hypothesis testing for your career itself. Like, do I enjoy being on that side of tech? Do I enjoy working in a PM kind of a role? Do I enjoy VMware? Do I enjoy the culture? Things like that. So
Yeah.
that's great that you were able to kind of find that and validate some of those, before you joined a full-time role. And I think, your journey of doing almost like a lateral move where you get into the company in not a PM role but in an adjacent role, and then prove to yourself as well as your manager and others that, hey, I can do this role, and then switch over. That's that's something that a lot of people don't consider, and they say, no, I'm only going to take a PM role. If you're not giving me PM, I'm not going to take it. But it's so much easier to transition to PM once you're already in the company. You've built up context, you've built up credibility and all of that.
Yeah, I used to be one of those people, Akash, which was even like in business school. I was even in first year. I was like, no, PM's all I'm gonna do. PM's all I'm gonna do. That one interview call that I mentioned ended up being for consulting, and I only applied for it because several of my friends said, "Listen, don't be stubborn about this. Keep your options open." So I think it was a bit of a humbling experience for me as well. That I mean, at the end of the day, you have to be flexible about what's happening. So yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. So great. You had a great internship, and did they give you the return offer while you were in the internship itself?
So it ended up being I didn't get a return offer. So what happened was halfway through my internship itself, I was told I wasn't going to get a return offer. And what my man this so there's a reason for this. My manager said, "You're not getting it, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to start making introductions to people in other teams within VMware, and go have those conversations." And like halfway through your internship, you hear this, you're like, I'm just not motivated to finish my work, right? Um, but I said, all right, at least she's, offering to give me to make introductions. So I started doing that. I started going for more networking calls. And the way the VMware internship also was set up was great because there was this big MBA community there. They would host these weekly lunches, which were called for the MBAs. So all the full-time MBAs would meet for lunch, and it was basically there's a lot of networking that you do as a part of your MBA experience, right? So it was ended up being a good opportunity for me to meet a lot of other people within the company. They'd host these fireside chats every week with various leaders in different roles within VMware as well. So that became another avenue to learn, to meet other people. So these led to a lot of like conversations with people within the company. Of course, later on, I found out that the reason why I didn't get a return offer was that particular business unit. They were planning to merge with a completely different unit, and my manager couldn't tell me at the time. And so she didn't want me to be in a situation where, come full time, my offer gets rescinded, right? So it was like I really appreciate how she handled that whole situation. And I think just finding out early on also made me really double down in terms of my networking within the Bay Area as well and reaching out to other people. So yeah.
Wow, yeah, that's really, sounds like you had a awesome manager who, not only was thinking a year ahead for you, but also, helped you make that transition, saw that you have the skills and probably, backed you with recommendations or discussions to join another team as well.
Yeah, yeah. She was a fantastic manager to have. Lots of lessons learned from her. It's a very useful lessons learned from her.
So that's great. And yeah, so then did you, finish interviewing for the full-time role during the internship itself? How did that transition process work?
So it's as you said earlier, tech tends to be really late in the process, right? So my feedback was put into the system, and typically at that time, MB or full time recruiting would happen at the end of the year, so sometime in December. So going into the second year of my MBA, like there was one particular cycle where like Amazon, Google, and a few companies would come on, on site or come to campus and go through that recruiting. So I said, all right, I don't want to go through what I went through in my first year, which was to get an internship pretty late on. I don't want to deal with that stress. So I really doubled down on, prepping for getting a full-time offer early on. Ended up cracking a couple, and I am, and you have like a long time to make a decision, right? But I was still keeping my fingers crossed about going back to VMware because I'd had such a great experience there. And I was like, even if it's not with that team that I'd interned with, there could be other teams that I'd be open to. So sure enough, they started somebody reached out saying, hey, some of these business units have openings. Would you be interested in interviewing? And yeah, things panned out.
That's great. So VMware, let's, like dig into VMware a lot now. And you spent 6 years at VMware, right? So maybe, starting off with, how would you explain VMware to a 5-year-old?
All right, just explain VMware to a 5-year-old. Uh, VMware is a really fun place. You'll make a lot of friends there. And it's a beautiful campus. There's a lot of place to run around and play. And you get to spend a lot of time doing interesting things, so doing fun things. I think that's how I'd put it to a 5-year-old.
Oh, that I'm sure will convince any 5-year-old. Nice. But
Yeah.
yeah, how do you explain the, more of the product and what does VMware actually do? Like what as a business, how do they function?
So VMware and it became very well known for solving for coming up with virtualization, right? And so at the end of the day, now you have this concept of a multi-cloud, but at that point of time, it was this people outside would hear about AWS and Azure and GCP, and that's all they think of as the cloud. But there was this distinction in terms of what the private cloud is and what the public cloud is, and VMware was the leader in what the private cloud was. So a lot of these companies that had to have house their own like intranet, for example, right? VMware is helping build software that helps you optimize all your, basically optimize your what's going on with your servers, how to cut down costs, and it's mimicking what the physical devices would be from a software perspective. So that could be compute, could be storage, could be networking. So yeah. And so I ended up working entirely in storage while I was there. And so my area at that point was focused on storage virtualization.
You know, VMware, like you said, is a very technical company, and it's obviously on the deep end of the technical side. Do you think your time as as a software engineer on the more technical side of things, did that end up helping you, or yeah, what was that like?
I think my first year from that perspective was pretty challenging because it was a very different technical domain. I think I took a very naive approach getting into a technical company, which was I said I knew I wanted to be technical, right? But I didn't understand what being technical in a completely new domain meant. And so I walk into this place, and all the people around me would introduce themselves as, "Hi, I'm so and so. I've been in storage for 10 years. Hi, I'm so and so. I've been in storage for 14 years." And so you're surrounded. And then I'd also have my engineering counterparts actually be very direct and tell me, "You're not from this domain, so you cannot accurately represent the voice of the customer." And it was pretty intimidating to be very like upfront. It was very intimidating to go in and realize that, hey, I'd made this decision and I hadn't fully thought it through. Should I have spent some time getting to know the place before getting to know the space before I'd started? So I think that was a big part of and a big challenge that I had to deal with in my first year or so.
Yeah, and I'm sure VMware's customers as well, you would interact with and speak to, basically try to empathize with. They're veterans with like 20 years in this space and industry. So, someone like, hey, I've just joined the industry and let me tell you what you should be using and what your solution should be. I'm sure that's got to be intimidating. How did you build up that context and empathy for your customers?
I think even before I thought about customers, the what I ended up focusing on was building relationships with engineering. Because I realized I'm not going to be able to talk to the end customer in a coherent way, right? So if I was going to go have those customer conversations, I needed to bring somebody along who could talk the technical talk. I could understand the business parts of it, but somebody needed to be there to help bridge that gap, right? So I ended up focusing very much in terms of what were problems that I could unblock for the engineers and the engineering teams, and then use that to start, building those relationships with customers. So if they weren't going to accept my PRDs, for example, what could I potentially do instead to make life easier for them? I think that's what I ended up focusing on.
What were some of the things that you did there?
So, for example, I had started off in a very nascent space. This was at the time when, containers like Docker and Kubernetes and stuff was an area that we were exploring. And we were in a situation where, we needed to get customer validation. But our customers, we had access to a big pool of customers, VMware customers, but a lot of them were not in a position to be implementing these technologies. There were a very small handful that was starting to investigate what it would look like running these technologies in their data centers. And so we were having a really hard time finding customers. So we said, instead of us going out and looking for customers, why don't we get customers to come to us? So I partnered with an engineer that I was working with, and we created a meetup. So we had this meetup that we started for storage for containers, and we partnered with like several companies in the Bay Area, and we started conducting like tech talks in the evening. So we ran this for a couple of months, and that ended up being a way for us to start, attendees who were coming to those sessions ended up being people that we were talking to get validation for this solution that we were building. And so I think just helping find ways to get people to represent the voice that we needed, like just this meetup, ended up being like one way to start building that credibility. Another thing that I did was we wanted to do a live demo. So VMware has this annual conference called VMworld, and we wanted to do a demo of this, storage plugin solution that we'd built. And it was put on me that you need to put this demo together. Now, up until that point, I'd never opened a terminal on my MacBook. I had no idea what it was. If somebody said bash to me, I'd see bashes all over the place, basically. And I spent a couple of days like going through the internet, figuring out how to deploy this plugin, how to get terminal running, all of those things. And I was able to put a demo together, like a coherent demo together. And the EM was really shocked. He was like, this is a person who has no computer science background, no coding background, and they've managed to deploy this plugin, get a working demo together. So they're willing to pull up their socks, when it's required. And so doing this ended up being a huge credibility building moment for me with that EM. And it became like an example that he would cite to other leaders saying, this is what Aparna has done. We're really glad to have her on the team. So doing things like this ended up becoming ways for me to start building and really developing those relationships.
Yeah, so you started stacking the small wins and showing that you really had value behind you. And also something I think you said is that there's parts of the role which engineers might be able to do, but they don't want to. And so, as a PM, if you can offload those things from the engineer, they'll be happy that, okay, hey, Aparna is taking on this stuff of like speaking to customers and putting together these roadmaps and stuff, which I could do as an engineer, but I don't want to. So, that's how she's helping me be more productive and more effective at what I want to do.
Yeah, yeah. I realize at least for me, what has worked is if I can't understand the technology just yet, focus on other problems. Where can you unblock things? And that's actually ended up becoming like a pattern for me in terms of all the teams that I've worked with. I've helped unblock them irrespective of escalations or whatnot. And that's really, really worked in my favor.
Maybe touching on the other side of the coin, are there any failures or mistakes that you made early on?
Um, in terms of mistakes that I made was definitely thinking I could talk the technical talk. Putting PRDs together when I didn't really understand the space because that was what was required. I think I needed a manager to give me permission to say, hey, listen, it's because we expect a PRD from you doesn't necessarily mean you need to produce a PRD. You can come back and say, I don't think now is the right time for me to put a PRD together. I'm not there yet, right? Like it was just such an aha moment for me to be like, hey, I can actually push back and say this is not what I need to do, because I had done a lot of competitive analysis about the space initially. I'd put something together, and now when I think back about that PRD, it was rubbish. There was nothing in there that was of benefit or use to that particular team.
And did you learn from that? Like, did you, have situations after that where you actually said, hey, I'm not ready for this PRD, or, now's not the right time?
Yeah. In fact, even in my current role, because again, I've made a pivot to a completely different technical space. I think one big part, as you go up, you start moving away from execution and focusing on strategy. I think putting up putting a strategy talk together early on made absolutely no sense for me, because I had to get familiar with the space that I'm working in first before I can go in and actually say, this is what's going on in the overall space. This is what other companies are doing. Should we be thinking about the same problems? And yeah, so I think that's become like a recurring theme for me, which is, you can push back or you can say no in certain places, and that's worked well.
Yeah, very true. I think it's when someone assigns you, especially something as important as a PRD, which is like that is the job of the PM, to come up with the PRD. Uh, it's tough to say no, or it's tough to even accept I'm not able to do this at this time. But you know, being able to say that and display that vulnerability, I think then also gives more credibility to your counterparts, where they say, hey, she's not just trying to fake her way through this. She really wants to partner with us, or she really wants to bring value to the team, and not just showcase how great she is or something.
Yeah, I think we've all bought into this idea of fake it till you make it, right? And it's very hard to step away from that, because at the end of the day, you're pushing yourself to get somewhere. But sometimes it's okay to say, hey, I can't fake it. It's a lot more value for me to take a step back, reassess, think about things objectively, and then move forward.
And when you would say that, what was the immediate reaction of your, engineering manager or your own PM manager?
I think I've been fortunate where my previous managers have been like really great sounding boards in terms of these things. Like, there were some very critical decisions that we've had to make. And if I was the one opposing it, my managers would actually sit down, listen to why I was opposing it, and then they'd have my back. Of course, if they felt I needed to change how I was thinking about it, they would make sure that we had a sound conversation about why, a very reasonable conversation about why I needed to pivot. And so I think that was one thing that helped. The other thing is just because I had built these relationships with my engineering counterparts, they would trust my judgment as well in those situations. And then at the end of the day, if I was wrong, they tell me I was wrong, and I would, I would agree and go along with it. It's at the end of the day, a lot of PM is like building and maintaining those relationships, right? And it's a balance because you have multiple viewpoints coming in. It's not just yours. So yeah.
Yeah, it's so many of these small, long-term building blocks, like the relationship building and the communication and the empathy and the trust, which often gets missed about the PM role. But it's one of those slow burn, or it's the slow burn side of the role where some of those things you have to really put in the time to get value in the long term. So
Yeah, I like that, the slow burn thing. That's a nice way to put it.
cool. So then you ended up spending 6 years at VMware. How did that, transit? How did that growth happen? What growth did you see in yourself as well as the company during your time?
So I think culture was a very big part of my decision to stick around there. The team that I was a part of was fantastic. And even during my interviews, after interviewing with a lot of people there, I remember walking away from it going, I would love to be a part of this team. And so it played a really big factor in me sticking around there for as long as I did. I think from a growth perspective, growth came from multiple angles. One was just purely, in terms of the type of products that I was getting to work on. I started off in this product called vSAN, and vSAN was in the hockey stick part of the growth curve. So it was a great way to see how the team was working to scale the product, how they handle decisions in terms of what features would get done, all of that. And then also how they focused on just growing out the customer base, right? So that was one big thing. From a skills perspective, one is, of course, the technical front. the other thing was just learning to deal with people better. I think learning to say no was a really big part of it. I used to really struggle with. I mean, at the end of the day, with when you think about the B2B space, right? There's people who are putting big dollars down to buy your products, and if somebody is unhappy, they will let you know they're unhappy because this is millions of dollars. And I would find myself just shutting down if somebody got confrontational, which was really hard, for me to deal with. Like I would just walk away from conversations, go to my manager, going, "You need to handle this," and they turn these things into learning opportunities for me, which was sit and observe how they handle critical escalations, how they handle delicate customer conversations, and that ended up being an area that I really got a lot more comfortable, which was handling conflict, handling tough situations, because it's a big part of PM, right? It's at the end of the day, a big chunk of being a PM is managing, not from a direct line, but you're managing people around you, and that's how you influence and get things going. So that ended up becoming a really big growth area for me.
And then you shifted from VMware to Airbnb. Those seem from the outside, at least, as two very different companies. How did you, think about that jump? Were you consciously again trying to say, hey, let me go see if the skills that I've built up at one place and one industry can be transferred to a different industry? Were you, interested in the travel space? How were you thinking of that?
I think I just approached this as I want to try something new out. And so what are the companies that excite me? That was how I thought about it. But I've been at VMware for 6 years, which is a while, right? And so you get used to doing things a certain way. It's what the processes are, what the buttons that you need to push to get things done are, right? And so I said, all right, I'm at this career crossroads where I could be at VMware for summertime, or let me just go see what else is out there. And so I started going after companies that I found interesting. And the thing is, I said, being in B2B for a while, let me see what B2C is like. Of course, I did want to rely on my technical background. So one filter was, which B2C companies do I find exciting? The other filter was, do these companies have roles where I could leverage my technical skills? And so that became my two criterias for picking companies. Of course, Airbnb ended up being a good one for me because I enjoy travel in general. Like I travel a lot. And so it was a company that was at the top of my list in terms of a good fit for me from just an interest perspective.
And so, what are the products that you are responsible for at Airbnb?
So I've switched to being a platform PM at Airbnb. What I own over here is the roadmap for iOS and Android development. So this is part of developer platform, and so I'm basically the PM for the tooling and infrastructure and services that we provide mobile developers at Airbnb to ship features for the mobile experience.
Okay, got it. And so, this is for internal developers or external as well?
This is for internal developers. And then, of course, there are things that the teams have built that can potentially be open sourced. Airbnb has a long history of open sourcing a lot of different things. So my customers are primarily internal customers.
How is that, shift been where you're now building for an internal audience? Is that, easier or is it harder?
It's both. I think one thing is that I'm not dealing with customers who have monetary commitments here, so that pressure is off. There isn't a direct revenue impact. It's not to say that that there isn't pressure in this job. It's not all the case. It's a very different kind of thing. Where it is challenging is, I think, when you're used to having access to a large base of customers to get customer, either customers or to sales teams and so on to get customer feedback. Um, it is different where you've got a much smaller subset of customers here, right? My teams are not, or my customer base is not as big, and so I have to, when we have like parallel beta programs going on, I have to make a judgment call in terms of who we're going to go after, because I can't go after the same set of developers and say, "Hey, can you try this out? And can you try this one, this out as well? And there's this third solution, right?" So it's a balance in terms of how we get signals to to see whether we're building the right thing or not.
Can you give me an example of what's something on your, what's a product or feature that would come to your roadmap as a platform PM?
So given that this is mobile development, so for example, on the iOS side, right, if Apple ships something with Xcode, for something as simple as just upgrading the version of Xcode, right, and making sure that nothing breaks in terms of the developer's life cycle, that could be something that we have to take care of. Similarly, if there's a new framework to do screen building or feature development, we need to make sure we have support for it. We need to make sure we have the right testing frameworks in place to use those screen building frameworks. So it could be a variety of different things like this. So it's to making sure that it's easy for a developer to code, it's easy for them to ship the code, and then the end user, of course, that's guests and hosts of Airbnb, don't get impacted because of all of these downstream things.
And how often do you get exposed to the Airbnb end users, the guests and the hosts, and think of products and features on your roadmap, but from the end users' point of view?
So far, not so much. I think for me, as I said, my customers are internal developers. Occasionally, where we've had some exposure is if something, if a test, for example, push notification gets sent out by accident to the end user, or there's a security incident, then you have to go in and basically work through that and make sure that you're resolving that quickly. So that's essentially where the overlap comes in.
Got it. So it's when there's some firefighting to be done, but it needs to be dealt with at the platform level itself.
Yeah.
Great. I've read a little bit about Airbnb's culture, and Airbnb has a lot of unique parts of its culture. But what are some things that have stuck out to you as unique?
It's a very, very open culture, Akash. When I didn't fully understand it when I joined. It is no topics off the table discussion wise here. So people are very empathetic and very open to having conversations irrespective of the topic, and I don't just mean professionally but even personally, which is really great. And then there's so much of I sometimes wish that the pandemic hadn't happened, because I've taken these tours of the office, and there's just these great stories of that you hear about, of things that have happened in the office. And so I wish that I'd had the opportunity to join when all of these things were going on there.
Yeah, I was watching one of Brian Chesky's interviews, and he talks about how you have your meeting rooms actually designed after actual homes that are listed on Airbnb. Is that true? Like, do and what's
Yeah.
maybe the favorite home that you like to take meetings from?
I think my favorite was this meeting room that's designed like this movie theater in the Castro in San Francisco. Um, it literally, like, even the monitor there is designed like a mini movie, movie theater screen. And so it feels like you're basically sitting in a little movie theater and conducting your meeting. But there's also another room that's designed like this Bedouin tent, and so even the chairs in there are like these stools and everything. There's a different meeting room which has a grand piano, like a piano, and like these bookshelves in there. and if you pull one of the books, the piano starts playing on its own. So there's a lot of these very, very cool meeting rooms throughout. And I've also heard that pre-pandemic there was a room with the ball pit, so people would go in and like just sit in the, in the ball pit and then conduct their meetings. And so I hope that comes back soon.
Wow, that sounds like so much fun. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, it's a great way for, folks at the company to put themselves in the minds of these hosts and guests and uh, come up with these experiences where it's still an office, but you're kind of almost living the platform in real life. Any mistakes, failures that you've had at Airbnb, things that you're still learning from?
I think it's the same thing as when I joined VMware, which is getting comfortable with the technical space, and really understanding what the problems are. In this case, because I think I just assumed mobile development was the same between iOS and Android, and now realizing that's not the case. So trying to figure out what the customer needs are there, identifying it, and then drawing a clear line between what this pool of customers needs versus what this pool of customer needs, and similarly what the priorities for the two teams are. That's been a big learning area for me and has had like a number of mini failures in the process.
And broadly, what's your view of the vision for Airbnb? Is it, how has that changed through the pandemic, and what are things that are continuing to change?
I think the one area was just how long term stays became such a big thing that has, and not just transformed our business, but just generally how people view travel right now. Even I noticed it with myself. I'd be okay with doing like a trip for 2 days. Now it is a minimum of a week somewhere, a minimum of 2 weeks somewhere, right? And so I see that as a continuing trend post the pandemic. I think where I'm very curious to see where we go is how we use like new technologies like AI and so on, just to improve and just build on the overall like experience for guests and hosts. So I'm very excited about opportunities there from an overall platform perspective.
Yeah, I'm sure you guys are already figuring out how AI is going to play into the platform, and what impact it's going to have. Are there any immediate, impacts that you've already seen
And from an AI perspective,
from a, yeah.
uh, no, not at the moment. But I can comment in terms of what we are doing in developer platform, and so I think we are starting to think about um, what AI could potentially do with the developer experience. But it's just something I'm just looking into. So yeah.
And broadly speaking, when you have something like this where, you have a new trend or a new market shift, how do you how do you come up with a vision for that? How do you come up with, this is how I'm going to extrapolate this by 5 years and build a vision for this?
I think that is just you work backwards, right? You see what's going on in that space. You know what your vision is for your team for the or or for your area in the next 3 to 5 years, and then you work backwards from there. So, what would an end state look like with this? If we were then go to the next step, what are the goals that we'd like to achieve if we're going to implement this? And so you kind of break down the problem from that perspective, and then start identifying potential use cases that you could go after with new areas.
Okay, I want to do a quick rapid fire round to get your thoughts on some stuff. So, you talked about that you read a lot of books. So, what are two of the most interesting books that you've read recently?
Um, these are so I think the one the most interesting one for me is this book called Designing Your Life. It's had a really big impact on how I think about various aspects of my life. And it's based on a course that's run at Stanford on designing your life as well. So it's something where you take a design thinking approach to how you're going to handle to various aspects. Another one that I've really enjoyed recently is called The Pathless Path. It's a story of how this person he's gone down a very non-traditional career path, but he's run a lot of like experiments and checks throughout his his life to figure out where he wants to go. So there's a theme around life design here for me clearly.
Very organized and structured. What's your go-to source for learning about new trends in product management and your industries?
I think in general, I keep I think my recommendations are tuned to just keep sending me things that would be of interest for me. So I don't have things that I particularly follow, but just purely for product, I really enjoy listening to Lenny's podcast. There's been a lot of great insights that I've got from there. There was a recent one about Gojek, which I really enjoyed listening to, and how scrappy they were in terms of just prototyping and trying out various solutions. So yeah.
Do you have a favorite YouTuber, someone whose videos you watch very often?
No. It's as I said, it's just anything and everything that's of interest. I will click and watch. I just consume a lot of content in general. So yeah.
Then are you a morning person or a night person?
Morning person now. I think MBA time was a different story, but I think the pandemics changed things a lot for me, and now I'm really enjoying getting my 7 to 8 hours of sleep. I'm in a very different like mental state every morning if I've got that. So morning person definitely.
What's a skill that you've picked up in the last 12 months? A new skill?
A new skill that I picked up in the last 12 months. Voice acting, actually. This came about as a result of just doing interview prep. And so I think just making that switch to like interviewing and just generally talking on Zoom was a bit of a difficult transition for me. And so one of my coaches actually was like, "Hey, I tried this out. Go try it out." And it ended up being a really really fun experience. There was one particular session where we had to voice a video game character, which was like completely different from what your voice, what my voice sounds like. uh, that was a very interesting and very fun exercise. So yeah.
That sounds very cool. So you're literally testing the boundaries of your voice and getting comfortable with all these situations that you're not used to, but from a voice point of view.
Yeah, it was, I mean, it's kind of, I guess, be open to what you can try out and see where it goes, right? So this was a very unexpected and surprisingly a very beneficial experience for me.
I've heard a lot of PMs say that they've tried out improv as a way to kind of flex their creativity, but voice acting is not something I've heard before. I'll definitely look that up. Maybe what's a skill that you want to pick up in the next 12 months?
I am very focused on building muscle and strategy for the next 12 months, because I have been execution focused. I mean, I've been able to launch and scale products, but as I grow, I think just being able to flex the strategy muscle is something that is important. So that's my area of focus for the next 12 months.
Last question. What's maybe some, advice or strategies that you would give to early managers or aspiring product managers of how they can grow into the role, how they can really, excel?
So one is think about transferable skills. Very, very important. The other thing is have conversations with people who have done PM. The reason being, I used to be this person who would advise anyone and everyone around me to go do PM because I was just so excited by it. And I would, help people make the transition. And then a year later, they would come back to me and say, I have to deal with so many people. The politics is crazy. Like, how could you tell me, you shouldn't have told me to do this. So I've kind of changed my tack for people who are aspiring to move to PM or who are early stage PMs, which is find out, from other PMs, what are the challenges that they face? What are things that they would change? Focus on that. Because at the end of the day, when you think about PMs talk about solving customer problems, and that problem is is what you're dealing with. And so that's going to be the thing that bogs you down. And if you don't know how to deal with it, this is going to be a role that you're actually not going to enjoy. So do the work to find out what gets into, get what it takes to move to PM and do PM. it will pay off really, really well.
Cool. Thanks, Aparna. This was a fascinating conversation. I think there's a lot of small notes that I've taken to definitely go back and look at. Voice acting is definitely one of them. But yeah, thanks for taking the time and chatting.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. This was really fun. It was a good walk down memory lane for me. So
Awesome. Thanks, Aparna.